Good afternoon and welcome to My Harlem Portrait, the show which is about Black excellence in everything. Today, we are going to interview excellence in politics and precisely the Honorable Inez Dickens, who is the Assembly member for the 70th District of New York State. She has been on our show before, so you know her, and everybody in Harlem knows her because she worked like crazy, and all her life has been dedicated to public service. Welcome again to our show.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you so much. It's good to be back. It's good to be back on your show. It's like rejoining with family again.
Thank you. It's too bad we can't be near each other, but that's
Yes.
okay. We are doing what we can in this.
That's right. That's what we're doing.
Times. So, talking about COVID times, I would like to start by asking you, what do you think of what is happening right now? We are in very extreme times, not only because of the COVID and this pandemic, but also because of what has been happening with George Floyd. George Floyd has been like the turning point because brutality against Black and brown people is nothing new. But the difference this time is that the whole world has seen it, and the brutality with which this crime was committed, the indifference of that policeman with his hands in his pocket and his laugh nearly on his face was so horrible that the whole world now knows, and the whole world has rejected it. So we are in really crazy times, and we are seeing that white supremacists are re-emerging again stronger because they feel that the whole world now realizes what they're doing. Mm-hmm. So tell me what you think about what is going on right now and the demand by Black Lives Matter and some part of Black Lives Matter.
All right. Well, I'll start first with the COVID. The COVID situation, I believe, started long before March of 2020. I think it was here last year. I think the federal government may have been made aware of it. They did not act on it. And it may have been because they did not think it was going to become a worldwide pandemic, because that's what it became, a worldwide pandemic. Here in the United States, New York state became the leader and had the highest rate of deaths and positive results on testing. And the Black and brown communities were more adversely affected than most any other community. And there's several reasons for that. Number one, in Black and brown communities, our heritage, our way of eating, and in fact, our DNA, people don't like to admit to that, but we frequently suffer more with cancer, heart disease, asthma, strokes, diabetes. We are more adversely affected. So when we get hit with a pandemic, people jump up and say, oh my God, we're hit more. But see, why? Why were we, it goes back to, and we can talk about the fact that we have less insurance and we have we do not have the best health care possible. It also is that we do not, our own, the way we live, we don't go to the hospital immediately. We usually try to treat ourselves with over-the-counter medications or medications that we have left over from some of the cold or whatever, before we even do go to a doctor or a hospital. So that's part of what has occurred. We do not go to the doctor right away. That's number one. Number two
That's
is
because
the
of
fact that
the
is the
price.
fact. Number two, our way of preparing food even adversely affects. We're learning slowly to use less salt, for instance, to cook without a lot of pork, for instance. But a lot of us still do. We were raised that way. And so, for instance, I've learned to cook greens, collard greens, without using pork, but I ate it with pork for 50 years before I finally learned that I could prepare it without pork. So, and that has, adversely affected us and caused us in most families to have hypertension, which is the precursor to having a stroke frequently if it goes without being under control. I have many friends who get pressure medications because they are diagnosed with hypertension, and they use the same medication for 2 and 3 years. And pressure medication usually has to be changed frequently, but we'll get the same medication and keep getting prescriptions renewed instead of going back to the physician and getting it changed because we feel it lowered it in the beginning and it continues to do so. But after 2 or 3 years, that has to be changed. Now, we can talk about the socioeconomic disparity, of course, that's in Black and brown communities. We know that. But there's also things that are inherent within our cultures that has negatively impacted and caused our immune systems to already be reduced. And so those are the things, when we get these pandemics, when we have no pandemic, we need to be researching to find out how do we raise our immune systems so that when pandemics do come, we are not, the Black and brown communities are not the most adversely affected. Now, that's on the COVID. On the Black Lives Matter situation, George Floyd was the latest. Well, he wasn't the latest because there was one shooting of a Black man in Atlanta in his back by the police. And shooting somebody in the back means he was not, the police had nothing to fear because he was running in the opposite direction. Yet they shot him and killed him and shot him in the back. So that was the latest, not really George Floyd, but George Floyd got the most notoriety. And the reason is because of the fact that now with cell phones, everybody has a camera. Practically everybody has a camera. See, years ago when Emmett Till was murdered and killed, everybody didn't have a camera. Most Blacks didn't own a camera, let alone a telephone. And telephones, of course, then technology didn't have cell phones, and they didn't have the ability to take pictures. And because of our poverty, we didn't own a camera back then. But then for 400 years, we've been subjected, Black and brown people, and Black people in particular, has been subjected to racism, to hate, to murder, and not just by the police, but by the public. This country was built by Black and brown people, and yet it's based upon hatred and fear of something that's different from yourself, and the hate of a skin color or texture of hair that's different from what you think is norm. And the white man in America, he was not the first. The Indians were here, the Native Americans were here long before anybody came over, and it wasn't Christopher Columbus anyway. Black history, brown history, our culture is not taught in the schools. So therefore, how can you expect there to be an understanding of mutual respect when the culture, the history is denied in the educational systems across the world? Not just America, but across the world. And so what's happened is that children are going to be raised to believe in whatever their parents taught them for the most part, unless there's something that causes them to think differently. They're going to be raised in the light of their own parents. You were, I was, most of us were. And even in the Black culture, we do not talk about the fact that we denied our own history ourselves. We don't like to talk about that, but that's a fact. When I was a child, because I came from a family that recognized our Blackness, supported our Blackness, and understood that it was not taught in the schools, so I was taught at home. I had friends, and I was only about 7 years old. I took out one of my Black history books that had been given to me by my father, and I was sharing it with about 8 friends. And that night, my father got calls from every one of their parents saying they did not want their children to be playing with me if I was going to tell them about slavery. And every one of those children were Black children. This was not white kids. These were Black children with Black mothers and Black fathers, and they did not want me to discuss slavery with their children. So for years,
Wow.
we ourselves denied our own culture. Those of us that thought we had maybe had been able to buy a little house with a white picket fence, or buy a car, or had arrived, if you know what I mean, they didn't want to discuss history. They did not want to tell at home their children's culture. Other cultures dictate and tell their children so that their history is carried on. And they will tell their history, good or bad. They will tell that history for centuries.
Yeah.
And we didn't do that. Now, starting in the I would say in the 60s, we started understanding that Black lives mattered, but Black lives always mattered. It's just that we didn't accept that, and we went along with what we were being taught about Dick and Jane in the public school systems. And not just public school, in private school, in any school you attended, no Black history or brown history was taught in the educational systems. That has to be changed. That will change part of the dynamic, not everybody, but that's going to assist in helping change the dynamics of the hate and the disrespect that has manifested itself today. Now, it's coming up today because the federal government has said it's okay to show that your hate. See, it never went away. It never was gone. It never was gone. It was always there, but it was kept quiet. And we go through, society goes through changes where in the up through the 50s, they were hanging us. We were, a fruit, strange fruit born on trees, not just southern trees, but northern trees as well. And so by the 60s, we started to thinking because of Martin Luther King, because of the Black Panther movement, because of SNCC, various movements, and even the song from James Brown, I'm Black and I'm Proud. All of that helped to shape us to realize that it's okay to be Black. It's all right to have natural hair, that it's all right to have darker skin. And so now that we have arrived at that, and back then, when we started to thinking that way, society then began to change in its way of thinking. When on television, people saw that hoses were turned on Black people and Black children were hoses, and bombs were set in churches where 4 little Black girls under the age of 12 were murdered in a bomb in their church, practicing their religion on a Sunday. So that's changed the way of thinking. But then by the 70s and 80s, it began to revert back. I would say in the 70s, it began to change again, and the racial hatred disparity began to raise its head again. But then again, it subsided. It did not get like it is today. Today, it has risen to almost back to what it was in the 50s. And the reason for that is because we have a federal government that has said it's okay, in effect, said it's okay that you show hate. We had because of the disparity in education, we could get admitted into various universities, and yet white people sued and said that's illegal and wrong, and that we shouldn't allow them to have the opportunity to attend certain universities. So it's been coming and changing over time. But then once this man got elected to presidency, he has made it legally okay. If
There
you
are
understand
nice
what
people
I'm saying,
on both
legally.
sides.
And so and now it's returning to what it used to be. But again, it's not going to be changed overnight. I commend people who protested, whether they walked the streets, whether they sent letters, whether they made phone calls, whether they wrote a letter, or just talked about it within the community. I commend all. I commend the young people. However, when you destroy a community, you haven't really accomplished anything. And that's why I was really very worried about whether there would be any destruction of property in Harlem, because the last time they destroyed in Harlem, when we were very upset when they murdered Martin Luther King, it took them 50 years to bring jobs back to Harlem. It took them 50 years to bring housing back to Harlem. It took them 50 years for us to get fresh food. It took 50 years for us to get an opportunity to be able to have our medicines delivered to us. And so I didn't want to have a repeat of that. And so I was very concerned about that, because although we have every right to demonstrate and protest, and rightfully so, the thing is that when it becomes destructive, and sometimes the police can cause there to be interaction, and sometimes we as the protesters can also cause interaction. In Brooklyn, for instance, two of my colleagues, a senator and my assemblywoman, Diana Richardson, she was pepper sprayed, and that's because the police didn't know who she was. Regardless of the fact she's an elected, the police do not know us. Years ago, when I was in the city council, I used to have meetings with all of the precincts that were in my councilmanic district once a month, so that the commanders would know who I was, and that they would invite me to their 7 a.m. morning meetings, so that the police officers would begin to know who I was, and be able to recognize me on face. That's not done anymore. It's not even done in my district anymore now that I'm in the New York State Assembly. And it needs to go back to that. That's why it goes back to the community policing. It goes back to being interaction, so that they will know who you are. Even if not every officer knows, there'll be somebody out there that can say, stop. That's Assemblywoman Diana Richardson. But and she was not out there demonstrating. She was out there to try to stem any interaction, like I did. There was a group that no one knew who they were, that wanted to have a nonviolent protest at 125th Street and Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard. That's Martin Luther King Boulevard and Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard. And when I got the call from the police that they didn't know who these people were, that somebody had made a call and said that they were from my office, and they knew they weren't, they were not going to allow them to use the plaza at 125th and 7th. And I said, absolutely not. They must have that plaza. And the group doesn't even know it. See, they don't have a clue as to what I stepped in and did, because they were going to not allow them to have the plaza. I opened it up, and I spoke to the mayor's office and had him to open it up. And he had to actually call the governor's office, because I told him, I'm the state elected. If that's state land, because that's what the city told me, that state land, they can't open it up. I said, I'm the state elected, open it. In addition, I called Larry Scott Blackman. He brought the alphas. I called Michael Gardner, the president of 100 Black Men. They came out. Deltas came out. I called personal friends and the restaurant owners, such as Melba's, they came out, and other restaurant owners came out in order to not to stop the protests, but to ensure that there was no interaction between the protesters and the police. This didn't have anything to do with stopping the protests. This was just to ensure. And there were little pockets. See, that's the thing. When you have a demonstration and you intend for it to be nonviolent, for instance, one of Larry Scott Blackman's alphas was there, not one, but several of them were standing there, and a young man, one of the protesters, called an officer over, and when he got to him, he spit in his face. Well, see, the police officer might have reacted, and probably would have, if it had not been for those alphas jumping over the barricade and wiped his face to calm him down so that he did not react to what was done to him. There was another incident with a white woman who, it turns out, when I asked her, she was from upstate someplace. So a lot of the protesters weren't even from New York. And that one in Harlem, a lot of them were not from, definitely were not from Harlem. And so my concern in these protests was that the holler was Black Lives Matter, but was there some underlying, I mean, not that we don't need support, we should support one another, but was there an underlying reason that was not related to Black Lives Matter as to why people were so angry and disenfranchised? Because, see, for instance, students are very angry because they've now had to incur big bills for their education, for college. They've got big debt that they got to pay back. It takes them years to pay back. They're very upset about that. They're upset about they go and get their master's degree, not just baccalaureate, but their master's degree. And what happens? They still can't get a job. So, I mean, there's a lot of frustration not related to Black Lives Matter, that when this came out, when this film came out of this officer with his knee on a man's throat, choking where you could see on the film, choking the life out of him, and he put his hand in his pocket and looked around. That showed an utter disregard for that man's life, and it's never done to anybody white. When a white officer does it, 100% of the times it's done to a Black or brown person. So that's why Black and brown people were so upset, because it happens only to us. We're the ones that's killed each and every time. They don't, it's not, if it wouldn't be so unfair if you said, well, all right, it's done 50-50, but that's not the case. It's Black and brown people that are murdered. And so that's what's caused the problem. Now, that's not to say every police officer, but that police officer should have been arrested on the spot. The other officers that sat there and let him do it, that stood there and let him do it, should have been arrested on the spot. The one in Buffalo, and that you saw the officer shove a 70-year-old senior man, 70-something years old, shove him to the ground, and you heard his head hit the sidewalk. You saw the blood spilling out. There was, out of all those police walking past him, only one officer bent down to help the man, and the officer behind him pulled him up and told him, no, don't help him. See, that shows, and that was a white man, by the way. But because he was out there with Black Lives Matter, they were like, what difference does it make? One of my buildings, a woman was married to a Black man, and he was in jail. She was still living there with their child, who was a baby under a year old. And she was murdered and thrown out the window. And when the police came, the discussion was, it serves her right for living up here in this community. So this shows you what I'm talking about. You know, this is to talk about, you know, the disrespect, the dislike, the hate
Total.
based on skin color, based only upon skin color. And in that case, she was white, but because she was living in Harlem, and see, that was before all the whites started to moving into Harlem. See, now you've got a lot of white people coming into Harlem, so you may not get that same response. But this is prior to them coming into Harlem. See, Black people stayed here so that Harlem could become, again, the jewel that it had once been. And we polished this diamond. And so now everybody wants to run into Harlem. But see, back then in the 60s and 70s, nobody wanted to live in Harlem. No white people wanted to come to Harlem. And so the white police officers' feeling was, if you white and in Harlem, then you get what you deserve. Versus now, they won't say that because there's so many white people coming into Harlem. Because to be frank, this is the cheapest place in Manhattan to live. That's to be frank about it. As high as the rents are, it's cheaper to live in Harlem than to go to Soho.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the most beautiful places in Manhattan.
And we have fabulous, our architecture is great. And we're now, we're having a lot of buildings rebuilt. The problem is that we've got to stay here. Those of us that stayed here through the hard times, the difficult times, that rejuvenated this community, such as, various organizations, such as the 100 Black Men who brought their office to Harlem, such as all the families that stayed here, such as the Lloyd Williams and the Greater Harlem Chamber of Commerce. All of those stayed here, such as Pat Stevenson with the newspaper, such as Amsterdam News. All of those stayed here in Harlem and made it a jewel, took back our community to make it a jewel. And now everybody wants to move here.
And the different theaters like Rosa Rivers.
Oh God, and Vi Higginson with Mama Foundation, all of them, and My Impact Kids, Jamal. Oh God, Joseph, I could just go on and on and on about and we have Northside Center, which is for our children with developmental problems, that stayed here, that was started by Dr. Clark. So I mean, these are institutions that have been built in Harlem, and you got to remember, there's 5 boroughs to New York City, 5 boroughs, and Manhattan was the first borough to elect a Black as borough president back in 1953.
Percy Sutton?
No. Percy Sutton was in the 60s. Hewlin Jack was in 1953. Hewlin Jack. Harlem had the first Black woman to serve in the New York State Assembly, Bessie Buchanan. Harlem did. Before any other borough in the city of New York. I'm sorry?
Harlem has always been in the forefront of
We've been in the forefront. That's not to be disparaging about any other borough or any other Black community, but Harlem has for years taken the lead in doing these things to try to ensure. That's why I tell people, don't be jealous of Harlem. Let's emulate it and let's bring it back so that we all lift it up in the same way, because no one had a Black borough president in 1953. Nope. And in the 40s, she was the first Black woman, was from Harlem, Bessie Buchanan. And yet you talk about her in the assembly, they don't even know who you're talking about. See, we got to know our history. Your history is what helps to lift you up. It gives you a good feeling. It gives you pride in knowing your history. That's why it's so important to know your history. That's why other cultures teach their history, so that the younger people will understand the contributions made by their people, by their culture, to the building of this state and this country.
We are coming to the end of this. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna end this episode, and then we start a new one where we talk about all the things that have been done and that you have been doing in Harlem during COVID. Should we do that?
We can certainly do that, because I've been working very hard, as of all the other electors across the city. Mm-hmm.
All right, so thank you for this. Now we talked about this current situation from the political point of view, from the human right point of view, the judicial system, and so on. In the next episode, with Honorable Inez Dickens, we are going to talk about Harlem situation with the COVID and what the Honorable Dickens and the other organizations in Harlem have been doing for the community. Thank you for being with us, and see you in 2 minutes.
Thank you so much, Maria. Thank you for hosting this week after week to ensure that everyone knows what's going on in Harlem.
Thank you. Harlem is my home.
Harlem has always been my home.
Thank you. All right. So